Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1944, the 48th season of the VFL, and the 5th season touched by World War II. While the war was dragging on, the prospect of victory was increasing. With essential services now fully resourced, some restrictions were eased. This allowed Geelong to re-enter the VFL, but the VFA would remain in recess for another year. Before we get to the difficult negotiations between the League and the Association, let's have a look at what was going on in 1944, the news and events that players and supporters were dealing with when they weren't focusing on the footy. Rationing of food had been a fact of life since 1942. Provisioning troops was the priority, as was sending supplies to the UK. Tea, an absolute essential at the time, was limited, while sugar was restricted to just half a kilo per person per week, which does seem generous, yet was considered only half the average consumption at the time. Things did get worse in January 1944 when meat rationing began. People were not happy. Meat was just such a key part of their diet. The initial allowance was about 1 kilo of red meat per person per week. The system was a bit complicated. Better cuts of meat, like steak, required more ration coupons, prompting complaints from those in wealthier suburbs. Sausages, rabbits, bacon and fish were not rationed, so they were there as alternatives, if you could manage to change your habits, and perhaps just raising the question of how much meat was in those sausages. But if you were like Jack Dyer, wanting to eat steak before a game, this rationing business could be a bit of a hassle. Bushfires are a fact of life in Victoria, regardless of whatever else is happening in the world. The summer of 1943-44 was one of the driest on record. Melbourne recorded just 1/3 of its average rain. Fires broke out in December, January and February. Many of the people and resources that would have normally responded were on active service, allowing fires to spread further and burn longer than otherwise might have been the case. Fires devastated regional areas like Wangaratta, Hamilton and the Grampians, amongst others. Closer to Melbourne, 63 houses were lost in the streets of Sandringham, Beaumaris and Blackrock, while 5 more houses were burnt in Glenroy. Between December and February, 51 people were killed, 700 injured and 650 buildings were lost across the state. Australia's biggest prisoner of war outbreak took place in Cowra in August 1944. Nearly 1,000 Japanese prisoners rushed the wire at about 2 a.m. on the 5th of August. Many of the camp buildings were set on fire. They were not looking to return to Japan, but wanted to honour their sense of Bushido. Dying in action was far more honourable than remaining a captured prisoner. During the event, 234 Japanese prisoners died, and 108 were wounded, and 3 Australian guards were killed. An officer was stabbed and killed during the subsequent hunt for the escapees. About 2/3 of the Japanese prisoners in Camp B remained within the confines of the camp, alive or dead. Over 300 men were recaptured in the 9 days after the escape. In 1952, the Cowra RSL began caring for the graves of the Japanese prisoners of war who lost their lives during the breakout. Branch President Albert Oliver was also instrumental in raising money for a commemorative Japanese garden during his term as town mayor. The last survivor of the breakout attempt, Teruro Murakami, died in Japan on the 14th of September 2023. October 1944 saw the Australian Navy supporting the recapture of the Philippines, and the heavy cruiser HMAS Australia was one of the first victims of Japan's desperate attempts to avoid defeat, the kamikaze attack. A dive bomber was observed heading directly to the Australia's bridge, hitting the foremast, killing 30 with 64 wounded. 2 sailors in the crow's nest saw the plane crash into the mast, just 1 metre below where they stood. They somehow survived unscathed. There would be many more kamikaze attacks before the war was done. An important moment in Australian politics occurred in December when long-time Carlton supporter Robert Menzies led the formation of the Liberal Party. Is it just coincidence that the Liberals used blue as their colour, or did Menzies want to support the Blues in football and politics? Around the world, the Allies were taking key steps towards victory. On the 4th of June, Rome was liberated, the first European fascist city to be free. 2 days later, the momentous D-Day landings occurred. Hawthorne's Dick Perry, a wingman who played 3 games in 1940 and 41 before he enlisted in the Navy. He was seconded to the British Navy, and on D-Day he was piloting a landing craft close to shore to direct artillery fire. His landing craft hit a mine, or perhaps it was shelled, and Peary and 2 others were killed. His brother would also play for Hawthorne, and Dick's nephew played for Richmond, St Kilda and Essendon. Ned Moyle, the son of Dick Perry's niece, now plays for the Gold Coast Suns. The Peary family was later told that the low casualty rate along that stretch of beach was attributable to the bravery and skill of their son, killed on his 24th birthday. By August 1944, Paris had surrendered. In September, as finals football was the focus in Melbourne, the Allies attempted the largest airborne operation of World War II, but failed to take the bridge at Arnhem. It was a bridge too far, a phrase that is now often brought out to describe a club's failed attempt for a final spot. In the east, the Red Army expelled German forces from Soviet territory, and their forces were moving forward, occupying Yugoslavia and moving through Poland. In the Pacific War, the last Japanese troops were driven out of India. The Philippines were retaken, and American forces moved closer to Japan, island by island. And, once airfields could be established in range, the Japanese mainland was bombed from June onwards. While Australian naval forces were tightly integrated into the American campaign in the Pacific, Australian Army units were left occupying islands and opposing Japanese forces that were being isolated by the American advance. There were dangerous mopping-up engagements involving more Australian troops than at any other time of the war, but arguably not strategically significant. In November, Franklin Roosevelt won an unprecedented 4th US presidential election. Some movie history was also made in February 1945 when a Captain America serial film premiered. This was the first appearance of a Marvel superhero outside of the comic book. Now we play footy at Marvel Stadium, and there have been just a few more Marvel superhero movies. Sadly, Dick Purcell, who played Captain America, collapsed and died only a few weeks after filming was completed. Perhaps the first actor to fall to the superhero curse. Let's have a look at the footy now. The National Football Council realised that there was no official guide to the nation's code of football. There were thousands of American soldiers in the country. They all should have a short, concise document outlining Australian football, and perhaps the game would take root when they returned home. Judge Raymond Kelly of the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration was commissioned to write a primer of Australian rules football. It was first published in 1944. 20,000 copies were printed, and while it did not lead to football taking off in America, it became a useful guide for students and was updated and republished for many years. The game finally had an official guide, so there would no longer be any confusion about the rules. Well, at least there was an official guide now. Before we get to the season proper, let's spend some time looking at how the quest for peace between the VFL and the VFA was progressing. The two competitions had been fierce rivals for decades. The VFA's popularity had grown dramatically in the late 1930s and early in the war, as they changed their rules, aiming to make their game faster, more entertaining, with less violence. Throwing the ball was the most radical change. Then there was the wholesale poaching of some of the biggest stars of the league, with extraordinary amounts of money. It all came to a sudden halt with Japan's invasion of the Pacific, and Australia throwing all resources into a wartime economy. There was only room for one football competition, and the VFA had been in recess since 1942. Despite some optimism in the second half of 1943, they were still on the sidelines for all of 1944. The association's position was further weakened by the unexpected death of their energetic, politically connected and entrepreneurial president, J.J. Liston, in April 1944. His name was given to the Best and Fairest Award of the Association in 1945. It continues today in the second-tier competition run by the AFL, with some former VFA clubs, the reserves of some AFL clubs, and other teams, with the AFL showing a complete lack of subtlety or tact or historical respect in 1996, was branded the VFL. What John James Liston would think of his name being awarded to the best and fairest VFL player can only be imagined. The association's position was weakened even more when Liston's right-hand man, Association Secretary Russell Keane Cohen, left the organisation in dispute about his compensation. These two men had taken the VFA from the edge of existence to a vibrant, growing concern before the war interrupted. Now the association would need to find a new president and secretary just as it was going into the most pivotal negotiations on the future of football in the state. A new president had to be appointed. There was an attempt to enlist Robert Menzies, who had strong political connections, but he had other demands on his time. The men taking on the job were Preston's experienced president, Harry Zwaar, stepping into the president's role, and Association Second Secretary, Harold Snook, who took over as secretary. Preliminary meetings went well, creating an air of optimism as the two sides entered a formal conference in September. Both sides wanted peace, to be ready for a post-war situation, a time of likely prosperity where the population would be growing, but with immigrants who were used to other codes of football. They both wanted peace, but not at any price. The league submitted its proposal first. Finally, it agreed to a shared board of control, with seats for association members and a two-tier competition with promotion and relegation. Demands the association had been making for years were now on the table. Yet, there were conditions. The top team, Division 2, would have to beat the bottom team of Division 1 in a playoff game to trigger promotion and relegation. VFL clubs would all continue to be VFL clubs regardless of what tier they were playing in. They would continue to have a share of all VFL assets. Harrison House was now a very valuable piece of property. VFL clubs alone would have control of internal VFL affairs. The dream that the VFA had been chasing was now in front of them, but they believed the cost was too high. The VFA wanted a full amalgamation, a joining of equals, nor did they want a challenge match to trigger promotion or relegation. The league politely pointed out that they were now running a full 12-team competition and crowds were at their highest since the war started. The association was still in recess, had not played a game in 3 years, and could they guarantee that all clubs would return as fully viable entities? Not surprisingly, the optimism soon faded. Relationships became tense, and despite multiple meetings, there was no progress. The association would not even agree to a permits-based clearance scheme to avoid a return of the poaching wars that rewarded some players but damaged club finances. Would things have been different if the experienced, politically connected, and savvy deal-maker J.J. Liston had still been around? He might have been able to gain a concession or two from the league and brought the association holdouts along with him. Alternatively, what if Bob Menzies took up the VFA presidential role and turned his back on politics? Could we have had a unified competition headed by Menzies and no Liberal Party? We'll never know. Aristotle did say peace is harder than war, and he was a well-known coach of the Philosophers team. The association would return in 1945, and there would be no football peace in our time. Was it a lost opportunity? Or did the VFA avoid the fate of being subsumed by a larger, more powerful league competition 50 years before that fate eventually became a reality? Impossible to say, but fun to contemplate. If you want more detail, I recommend Xavier Fowler's The Football War, which captures a history that has certainly been largely ignored by the AFL. 1944 got off to a good start for the league. Geelong was back in the competition. The travel restrictions had eased, and while there would not be any special football trains, the transport between Geelong and Melbourne was seen as achievable. The Cats would stay at Cardinia Park, having been evicted from Junction Oval in 1940 so the Army could use it. And Cardinia Park, known by a variety of sponsors' names, is still their home today. St Kilda was allowed to return to the Junction Oval, and South Melbourne joined them. Far more convenient than trekking north to Princess Park for home games. There was some tension with players and payments. In April, a number of Essendon players did not attend a practice game against Geelong. The issue was money. By May, the league agreed that while match payments would stay at 30 shillings, clubs could increase payments into the players' Provident Fund from 10 shillings to 30 shillings. The Provident Fund was a deferred payment players could access when they retired from the game. Checker Hughes addressed the player payment issue with clear insight, decades ahead of his time, in the Sporting Globe in September. He declared VFL players were the poorest paid entertainers in Melbourne, sharing an insight from an American Marine who thought the admission price to the game was too low for it to be any good. He would not even go into the ground. Hughes suggested a price increase of 3 pennies to be allocated to players on a pro rata basis based on games played and paid out on their retirement. A proper recognition of the entertainment value provided. It would be decades before TV rights ensured the players who put the game on received an appropriate remuneration. Checker was onto something back in 1944, even if the revenue would eventually come from broadcasting rather than admission. There were attempts to form a players' association in 1944 when Frank Reid, a former secretary of Essendon and a life member of the VFL, led the push for an organisation of past and present players, calling it the Victorian Footballers Club. The aim was to promote social welfare and the economic advancement of its members. A similar attempt had also been made in the 1920s. The 1944 version started with a level of enthusiasm, but again faded away after a couple of years. An effective players' association was still decades away. 1944 was the 14th season that finals had been played under the McIntyre system, with 2 semis, a preliminary and a grand final. However, in the middle of the season, Carlton's delegate, Horry Clover, proposed a Final 5 system. 2 grounds would be needed, with the first week of the finals seeing the top team get a bye. 4th would play 5th in an elimination final, and 2nd would play 3rd, the winner going into the second semi against the top team for a spot in the grand final, and the loser moving on to an elimination first semi-final against the winner of 4th versus 5th. The plan was approved 7 votes to 4 in the match arrangement committee. Drivers for the change were concerned that the Junction Oval would not be able to cope with the large crowds expected for finals in 1944. And, with most clubs coming from the north of the city, transporting crowds to the Junction Oval might be an issue, even though there were plenty of trams running down St Kilda Road. With 2 additional games in the final series, the league would also reap financial windfall. The proposal needed a 75% majority at the delegates' meeting to change the rules of the competition, and it was lost 11 votes for and 11 votes against. The Final 5 system was eventually adopted in 1972, 28 years later. By then, though, the second ground was the league's own VFL Park. Let's have a look at the coaching position now. There were 4 new coaches taking the reins across the 12 league clubs, about average for this era. Geelong were returning after a 2-year gap, and the job of reuniting players who had been distributed amongst other clubs and some newcomers was Tom Arklay as honorary non-playing coach. It would be a challenging job, but he would be bringing his playing and leadership experience. As a former champion ruckman/defender, 1937 premiership player, 1938 and 40 best and fairest, and captain in the club's last season, 1941. The Geelong committee thought he was the man imbued with the Geelong spirit of dashing football. Although how much dashing the new team would achieve in their first year was yet to be seen. Despite initially taking on the role as a non-playing coach, he took the field by round 9 when the side was short of players and played out the rest of the season, helping the team achieve 1 win for the season. Hawthorn would lose the services of Roy Cazaly, who went to Tasmania to open a massage and physiotherapy business. While that was the end of the legendary Cazaly's involvement with the VFL, he would continue to coach Newtown in Tasmania between 1948 to 51 for 3 premierships. Tommy Leigh, who had established himself as a leader since joining from the VFA's Port Melbourne in 1942, retired as a player and took over as non-playing coach. North Melbourne welcomed back Bob McCaskill as coach. He had been in the role for 2 years when called away for military duties in 1942. Bill Finlay had taken over as captain coach halfway through 1942 and retained the position in 1943, but he would see out his time at North as a player, while Daley O'Brien captained under the astute leadership of Bob McCaskill, who had coached Sandhurst to 9 premierships in 15 years. St Kilda also appointed a new coach. Hugh Thomas established his coaching credentials with the Collingwood Seconds from 1922 to 1938, with 2 premierships, numerous finals appearances, and a reputation for developing young players. Unfortunately, he was the loser in a fierce factional fight at the Magpies when a bitter split exploded in 1939 between those who backed seniors coach Jock McHale and those on the Thomas side. Thomas had coached the St Kilda second 18 to 2 premierships and now, finally, had his chance at the senior level, an opportunity that was barred by McHale at Collingwood. Thomas was looking forward to the opportunity and the chance to engage his former colleague. Catering options in this era were much simpler than what the modern supporter would expect, and wartime rationing imposed even further restrictions on what was available for hungry spectators. At the start of the 1944 season, there would be no peanut boys working the crowd because there were no peanuts. Saveloys would still be available, what we would call hot dogs in rolls, but who knows what was actually in the filling. Even the quarter-time oranges were scarce. Apples were plentiful, but oranges would only become available later in the season. Some clubs used lemons in place of the traditional orange during breaks in the game. Richmond supporters and opposition clubs were set a challenge in 1944 with the debut of identical twins, Fred and Keith Cook. It was so hard to tell them apart, Jack Dyer insisted that they wear different coloured jumpers at training. The season opened on Saturday the 6th of May with over 71,000 people attending the 6 games. While still down on pre-war levels, this was the biggest opening round since 1941, with 6 games on offer and the threatening atmosphere of 1942 fading. People were ready to go to the footy again. Yet the war was still going, and all games started with a tribute of 1 minute silence to honour the fallen, followed by the haunting sounds of the last post. A sombre moment any time it is heard. Knowing that battles were still raging, family and friends at the front line, it must have been a truly heartfelt moment. Richmond were able to hold off an improved Melbourne, while Essendon had an easy win over Hawthorn, who were not up to their 1943 form that almost had them in the finals. South Melbourne enjoyed a home game against Carlton that was not at Princes Park. It wasn't the Lakeside Oval either, but the Junction Oval was much closer to home, and the Swans led all day, winning by 27 points. North were yet again defeated by Collingwood, who seemed to have some power over the Arden Street team, even in their 20th season in the VFL. Fitzroy hosted Geelong in their return game, but showed no mercy, winning by 10 goals. The only close game of the opening round was at Brunswick Street, where Fitzroy came from behind in the last quarter to win by 9 points against the Saints. Round 2 saw Richmond playing their second game of the season at Punt Road, but this was their first home game against North. The previous week was a home game for Melbourne, still using the Punt Road Oval because the MCG was not yet available. Before the Richmond North game, both sides lined up to see the premiership flag unfurled. Rather than the club president or his wife, it was Captain Blood himself, Jack Dyer, given the honour by President Harry Dyke as a recognition of his outstanding service to the club and leadership in achieving the club's 4th premiership. The Tigers won against a spirited North Melbourne, but lost Jack Broadstock to a knee injury that would limit him to just one game until round 15. Jack Dyer was reported, but cleared at the tribunal. This was his 14th season and 207th game, and he had never been suspended, surely reflecting the clean style of play that has been misrepresented over many years. South Melbourne had signalled the challenge they would face in getting to Kardinia Park for the round 2 clash well before the season started due to transport challenges, sparking talk of a possible forfeit. While Geelong agreed to provide transport from the Geelong station to the ground, that relied on most players getting to the 12:20 train and the train not being late into Geelong. But the train was 15 minutes late, and Geelong's first home game since 1941 did not start until 3:12 p.m. There was still time for the Geelong Highland Pipes Band to pipe the visitors onto the field to celebrate the return of football to the pivot, and a more solemn moment when players from both teams lined up in a V for the playing of the last post and national anthem. Geelong played well, yet South were 19 points up when the bell rang out to end the game, though it might have been hard to see the scoreboard in the early evening gloom. Wartime conditions meant rationing for many of the ordinary items like clothing, which created a challenge when trying to put a team on the field. Richmond received permission to make an appeal to their supporters, who generously donated enough precious ration coupons, normally not transferable, to allow the Tigers to buy 18 pairs of boots and 50 pairs of shorts, which would remain the property of the club, managed by eagle-eyed property stewards. By round 6, the season was already 1/3 complete, with the ladder showing some changes from the previous season. Supporters might have been distracted by the big news of the previous week, with the Allies taking Rome, and then the launch of the mighty D-Day invasion in France. But the footy was still happening. Carlton were on top with 5 wins, their only loss back in round 1 against the Swans. Richmond was second with 4 wins and a draw against Footscray. South, clearly enjoying playing closer to home, were third, ahead on percentage of Fitzroy, both on 4 wins. Essendon had been a powerhouse in recent seasons, but they were now sitting 5th, with 3 wins and a draw. In the lead-up to the finals the year before, Hector Lacey wrote that if Dick Reynolds were to drop out of the side, it would break up into a rabble. Well before the start of the 1944 season, Dick Reynolds had been struck down by appendicitis and would not return until round 8, with the Bombers still on 3 wins and a draw. It would seem to justify Hector Lacey's verdict. In addition to getting over his surgery, Reynolds was working as a supervisor at the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory at Fisherman's Bend, producing military aircraft. The job required long hours, and like all essential services roles, it took priority for football commitments. He could not spend the time on coaching and game preparation as he had in earlier seasons. Footscray was 6th, trailing Essendon by percentage. North had started the season well by their standards, but perhaps yet not satisfying the standards of new coach Bob McCaskill, with 3 wins from 6 games. Ahead of St Kilda, 8th on 2 wins and that draw with Essendon. Melbourne and Collingwood were 9th and 10th with 2 wins, followed by Hawthorn, also on 2 wins, but being hit by injuries, preventing them from following up their standout 1943 season. Geelong were back in the competition, but last without a win. It had been expected to be a tough year for the Cats, and it was proving so. Round 6 was held on a cold, wet June Saturday, so wet that about 1,500 St Kilda supporters rushed from the outer to shelter in the comfort of the members' grandstand. They at least got to watch the draw with Essendon dry and a little warmer. At Punt Road, the draw was caused by a moment of drama when Dick Harris had a shot to level the scores, but kicked out of bounds. The Bulldog supporters were delighted, but then shocked when the umpire called the ball back, giving Harris another shot. The man on the mark had stepped too far forward. Harris kicked truly on the second attempt to level the scores. Also, Don Henderson of Footscray was reported for striking Jack Dyer. Clearly, yet another unprovoked attack. At the tribunal hearing, Dyer said he was leading for the ball and Henderson had just run into the back of him, and he told the umpire at the time that he had not been struck. Indeed, Dyer told the tribunal chair that if he had been punched, he would have retaliated. But if a player runs into me, it's their own fault if they get hurt. After the verdict was given, with a 2-week penalty, Mr. Ramsey, who'd been representing Don Henderson, said, "I cannot understand your decision. Any player who strikes Jack Dyer deserves a Victoria Cross. There were a few more tense exchanges, but the penalty stood." Dick Reynolds was still out for round 7, and Essendon lost to Collingwood, who relished their 3rd win of the season. Things were looking grim for the Bombers, and Reynolds called a team meeting to refocus the players and perhaps clear the air. He took to the field in the round 8 game against North Melbourne, half a game ahead of them on the ladder, and the Bombers soared, winning by 84 points. In this era, the most common way to get to games was by public transport. But 1944 saw some real challenges. Electricity generators relied on coal shipped from New South Wales, and in June there were shortages, leading to restrictions on the number of trains available. Compounding the issue were ongoing negotiations with tramway workers on the issue of running extra trams. Workers felt they were already doing enough shifts every week, with the limited manpower available resulting in 13-day fortnights for drivers and conductors. It all became a bit messy at the end of June. The Premier declared that the lack of trains meant that the Moonee Valley races would be cancelled. It was chaotic at Windy Hill at the end of the Essendon North game. No extra trams were scheduled, but 24 standby crews wanted to help their colleagues struggling with overcrowded trams. But the depot authorities said no. When the crews tried to shift the trams from the depot, the power was cut. Meanwhile, police had to put a special guard at the Premier's home after he received a telephone bomb threat for cancelling the races. There might still be a war on, but some people were not happy if the races were cancelled. At least the footy was on, even if a bit crowded getting home. Round 10 provided a certifiable grudge match when 8th place Collingwood travelled to 9th on the ladder St Kilda. The result wasn't going to affect the finals, but it was the first time that former Collingwood reserves coach Hugh Thomas could take on his former colleague and rival, Jock McHale. Thomas had been successful with Collingwood reserves, but he was always destined to be in the shadow of Magpie legend McHale. The split of 39 was still fresh in everybody's mind. The cause depended on whose side you took. Had the reserves committee been spending too much money? Was McHale jealous of any credit being given to Thomas for developing players so they were successful when they got to the seniors? If you want more of the gory details, check out the episode of 1939. For now, we can say time hadn't healed any wounds. Hugh Thomas focused his team on the absolute importance of beating the Magpies and McHale. He stirred them up and he got them going. He told his players, "This is a team what gave me the arse." St Kilda thrashed Collingwood by 68 points in front of 10,000 supporters. Thomas would have been thrilled. McHale, a man who hated losing any game, would have been furious. It was their only clash for the season. Both men would have to wait another year to continue the battle. Collingwood also featured in a notable game in round 11. when they went to Punt Road to take on the Tigers. If Hugh Thomas did not like Jock McHale, then Jack Dyer would put his hand up to join that club. Dyer hated all things to do with Collingwood, and perhaps Jock McHale most of all. But Jock was an old man, coaching on the bench, while Dyer was out on the field. Yet, Jock McHale Jr. took the field that day. To quote Dyer from his somewhat theatrical autobiography, "The apple of old Jock's eye, the fruit of his loins, Jock McHale Jr., wearing the hated black and white Guernsey." So Dyer ran through McHale Jr., belting him hard with all the years of experience he could muster. Jock was knocked down, but he was not out. He got up and punched Jack hard in the head. So Dyer retaliated, and his run of good luck, or his years of cunning, whichever way you look at it, were over. He was reported and suspended for 4 weeks. The first suspension after 215 games, and the only suspension in his entire career. Jock Jr. also went down for 4 weeks. Jack said he could have got Jock off. He would normally follow the code, as we saw earlier in the season, never admitting to have been struck, but the memory of Sid Coventry claiming Joe Murdoch had hit his boils still burnt. A claim we have identified in the 1936 episode as somewhat doubtful, despite its repeated retelling. Yet, as we have seen, some claims made by Jack in his colourful biography might be there to improve the story rather than sticking to the facts. In the news reports of the tribunal hearing, Dyer said that he was not struck by McHale. They both still got 4 weeks. By round 12, the season was 2/3 complete, and the ladder providing a good indication of who would be playing finals this year. On top was Richmond, a game and a half clear of the Blues, who were looking to proceed further than their lost semi-final in 1943. Fitzroy were having a better year than the disappointing 1943, where they missed the finals. They sat third, a half a game behind Carlton and a half a game ahead of Essendon, who made up the 4. Fitzroy were half a game behind Essendon, knowing they had to do better in the final 6 games if they were to make consecutive finals appearances. North Melbourne had made significant strides since Bob McCaskill had returned as coach. Just 1 game out of the 4 at this point of the season, in their best performance since joining the league. Could they make the finals for the first time? St Kilda sat 7 on 4.5 wins, one of several clubs to have had a draw this year. Too far out to make the finals, but maybe they could still disrupt the season for others above them. South Melbourne sat 8th, followed by Collingwood, then Melbourne, and Hawthorn's exciting 1943 season was looking like a flash in the pan. Injuries and a loss of form dropping them to 11th, and Geelong had yet to win a game in their return to league football. The round 13 game at Arden Street between 6th placed North Melbourne and top of the table Richmond produced both a surprise win for North Melbourne and proved that sometimes bad kicking isn't bad football. The Tigers were wonderfully accurate that day. 14 goals and just 2 behinds would be applauded in any era. North only kicked 11 goals, 3 less than the Tigers, but the additional 21 behinds tells how much the ball was in their forward line, and on this occasion, despite kicking 3 goals less than their opponent, they were still able to win by 1 point. Not a strategy many coaches would recommend, though. Collingwood were hosting Fitzroy in round 14, and also hosting a long-time friend of Jock McHale, the former Brunswick VFA half-forward flanker and wartime Australian Prime Minister John Curtin. The Magpies were behind at half-time, and Jock invited the PM to have a few words to the team. Curtin emphasised the importance of teamwork, but there was no storybook comeback. The Bulldogs, stronger all day, winning by 39 points. Despite the result, it would have been a welcome break from the strains of running the country for the Prime Minister. In round 15, Fitzroy hosted North, and they had been expected to win. But it took a massive kick by Harry Hickey in the last minute of the game to score the winning goal. Hickey was a handy player for the Bulldogs. Round 15 also saw the return of Jack Broadstock to the Richmond team. He'd done his cartilage in round 2 and only played one game in round 7 since. He had spent much of the intervening time in Adelaide. Was he there on holiday, or was he getting specialist medical treatment for his knee? As so often with Broadstock, the answer depended on who you spoke to. Whatever he had been up to, he was back at training the week before the big game against Fitzroy. Jack Dyer, who still had 1 week of his 4-week suspension to serve, wanted him in the team. Broadstock kicked 2 goals, but the Maroons were winning all over the ground and finished the game 50 points in front. Now it was time for the Tigers to have a team meeting. 3 losses in a row was raising plenty of questions. Perhaps Dyer's absence was one explanation, but with the team dropping to third, just half a game ahead of an improving Essendon, issues still needed to be addressed. Before we leave the topic of the elusive, mysterious, mercurial Jack Broadstock, I wanted to follow up on the famous story that he was absent without leave and being chased by MPs in the lead-up to the 1943 grand final. While Michael Sexton, in Finding Jack Broadstock, debunked the AWOL story, given Broadstock had been discharged from the Army for more than 2 years, another explanation could be that Jack had not registered for the mandatory militia service, the equivalent of what we would now call the Army Reserve, that was empowered to conscript men for service if they were not already in essential services. Whatever the reason, trouble was never far from Broadstock. As supporters and players prepared for round 16, they would have been excited that the Allies had successfully landed another invasion into the south of France from the Mediterranean. As the Germans retreated from this front, the liberation of Paris was imminent. It seemed the Allies had the momentum, but there was still a long way to go. Well, the news from Europe was electric. In the VFL, round 16 would be pivotal. The top 4 teams were playing each other, while Essendon, waiting to push their way into the 4, had the trip to Geelong, and they had the easy win. A record crowd of 38,000 were in Punt Road and saw Richmond, with Dyer back on the ground, keep Carlton to just 1 goal in the first half. The Blues did better in the second half, but the Tigers won by 18 points. Their losing streak was over. At the Brunswick Street Oval, Fitzroy were 5 goals up at 3/4 time. Maroon supporters contemplating another win, only to see the Bulldogs stage a magnificent comeback attempt. Fitzroy had kicked 13 goals in the first 3 quarters, but in the fourth, they only got the ball past half forward 3 times and could only score 1 behind. With Brownlow medalist Norm Ware and Harry Hickey dominating the game, the Bulldogs kicked 4 goals, but sprayed a wasteful 7 behinds. They had the game on their terms, and if it had gone on for a little longer, they surely would have won. But when the bell rung, it was Fitzroy in front by 2 points. The ladder had Richmond on top, then Fitzroy and Footscray all on 46 points, with Carlton 4th, level on points with Essendon 5th. 5 teams battling for 4 final spots and just 2 rounds to go. In round 17, Carlton thrashed Geelong by 106 points to provide a much-needed percentage boost with Essendon breathing down their neck. And that seemed a good result, until the scores from the Essendon-St Kilda game were posted. A 106-point win to the Bombers. Fitzroy had an easy win against South Melbourne. The match of the day was the Footscray-Richmond game at the Western Oval. The Bulldogs went into this game undefeated at home, and knowing they needed to win, given Essendon and Carlton were sure to win their games. It was one of the biggest games held at the Footscray home ground since they had joined the league. Richmond also needed a win after their recent slump. It was clear the Tigers were back in form. They led all day and won by 25 points, and they moved to second, behind top-place Fitzroy, on 50 points. The Bulldogs dropped to 5th, with Carlton and now Essendon 3rd and 4th on 48 points, 2 points ahead of Footscray. In the final round of the season, both Fitzroy and Richmond needed wins just to make sure of their spots, and easy wins against Geelong and Collingwood removed any need to calculate mathematically possible scenarios. Essendon also had a comfortable head out against South Melbourne to lock their spot in the finals. Not bad for a team that only had 3 wins out of their first 7 games. The match of the day for the final round was at Princess Park. Whoever won was in the fall. Fitzroy were coming off a 25-point loss, while Carlton had just won by 106, and yet, in front of 34,000 people, the game was close all day. At three-quarter time, the Bulldogs were up by 2 points. Carlton kicked 3 goals to 1 in the last quarter, and with 7 minutes to go, they were 17 points up. Finals seemed to beckon, but the Bulldogs started getting the ball into their forward line and kicking a rapid set of goals. However, just like that game against Fitzroy, they were also spraying the ball through the behinds, scoring points when goals were needed. As the final seconds ticked down, the scores were level. A draw was good enough for Carlton. Once again, in the final moments of the game, just like against North Melbourne in round 15, Harry Hickey had the ball. He took the mark and the bell rang. Scores were level. He launched his kick from about 50 metres out. Bob Chitty was a well-known hard man who had been playing for Carlton for 8 seasons. He rose in the pack and took the mark, but the goal umpire said the ball had crossed the line. Another behind to Fitzroy. It was all they needed. They won the game by 1 point. Chitty later said that if he had have heard the bell, he would have made more of an effort to punch the ball away before it had a chance to cross the line. It had been a classic game, and that ball, crossing the line by the smallest of distances, gave Fitzroy victory by the smallest of margins. They were in the finals, and Carlton's season was over. The Blues had been in the fall since the end of round 4, but now they just had a Silver Almostus Award, recognising the fact that they went into the last round of the season in the fall and finished out of it. A tough season for Carlton. North finished their season with another win against St Kilda to take 6th spot with 10 wins, their best season in the VFL so far and creating hope for the future. South were also 7, one better than 1943, so maybe they felt they were heading in the right direction. Melbourne took 8th spot, followed by St Kilda, Collingwood and Hawthorn 11th, back in familiar, if disappointing territory after their promising 1943 season. Geelong had managed 1 win, and their wooden spoon would not have been a surprise in their first season back, but they would be looking for better things to come. There would be no Brownlow this season. It would return after the war in 1946. The finals in 1944 were held at the Junction Oval, St Kilda's home ground, given the MCG was being used for military service. One reason for the change from Princess Park, used for the 1942 and 43 finals, was the inadequate tram services provided in 1943, leading to chaotic scenes at the corner of Elizabeth Street and Flinders Street in the hours before the game, and leaving many supporters having to walk long distances after the 1943 Grand Final. The decision on the finals venue was made in early June, but was, as is often the case with league decisions, shrouded in some controversy and dissent. Technically, the Match Arrangement Committee was the body that should have had the responsibility for deciding the finals venue, so it came as a surprise at the June committee meeting to hear League President Dr. McClellan say that the League was irrevocably committed to the use of the St Kilda ground. The committee did not even know what the financial arrangements were. There was some spirited conversation between the committee members, and some pointed questions were asked of the President, yet he insisted the League had asked him to make the arrangement, and he had. Committee members were then in the unenviable position of either having to accept the decision or force a confrontation with the President, possibly leading to his resignation if he could not follow through with the commitment he had already made. A situation that would have been very disruptive for the League, still operating under wartime conditions, and the pending negotiations with the VFA to resolve the post-war future. The delegates chose stability, even if they were not convinced on the merits of the Junction Oval. It was a close-run situation, though, with the match arrangement committee only agreeing by 6 votes to 5 to the decision made by the president. So the first semi-final between Essendon and Footscray would be at the Junction Oval on Saturday, the 9th of September, on a slippery, wet ground after the rain on Friday night, continuing into the Saturday morning. 25,542 were at the game, well down on the 1943 first semi-final at Princes Park. It was a long trek from Essendon and Footscray, so perhaps some supporters were voting with their feet on the choice of finals venue, or maybe it was the weather. The Bulldogs were making their third appearance in a semi-final. They had lost against South Melbourne in 1942 and dipped to 6th in 1943, so they were keen to make a deeper run into September this year. But they did not have the experience of this Essendon team, who had played in the last 3 grand finals and were aiming for a 4th after a slow start to the season. Footscray looked a little out of place in the first quarter, with Essendon playing the better football in the slippery conditions. Yet, both teams just scored 1 goal and only 2 points separated the teams at quarter time, so no real damage done. The next 2 quarters were extraordinary mirror images of each other. Essendon were dominant in the second term, kicking 6 goals and keeping Footscray scoreless. At the half-time break, it was as if the teams swapped roles, and in the third quarter, Footscray were the vastly superior team. They kicked 6 goals to the Don single, and there was just an 8-point gap leading into the last quarter. It was set for an exciting finish, but which team would have the upper hand? Both sides got early goals before Essendon started dominating play, yet a strong Bulldog defence kept applying pressure, resulting in 8 behinds in a row. Essendon were moving further ahead, but an accurate shot or 2 would have made their supporters much more confident. Dick Reynolds was a champion and an extraordinary leader, and he did what champions often do, kicking the goal that changed the shape of the game. It was as if the elastic band holding Footscray close enough to be a threat snapped with that Reynolds goal, and the Bombers piled on 3 more to run out easy winners in what had been an odd game of switching momentum. Essendon into the preliminary final and Footscray's season over. Richmond and Fitzroy lined up in the second semi-final the following week. It rained again in the lead up to the game, and the wind blew straight down the ground. There would definitely be a scoring end. It was a tough, scrappy opening term. Rough could be another description, as each team tried to impose themselves on the game. It wasn't only players suffering. Fitzroy's trainer, George Coomber, raced out onto the ground to assist a player, and in a collision of 2 other players, George was knocked out cold by a Fitzroy man. He was flat out on the ground as other trainers ran out to support their colleague. He was stretchered off and seen to by the club doctor, Alan Keane. While all of that was going on, Richmond trainers were looking after their star forward, Dick Harris. A key part of the Tigers' forward line, he had kicked 63 goals in each of the last 3 seasons. Now, in the first quarter of the 1944 semi-final, his knee had crumpled underneath him. The trainers picked him up and helped him off the ground. 19th man Roy Quinn took his place. Dick Harris's 196-game, 540-goal career was over. Despite the Tigers kicking with the wind, Fitzroy led by 8 points at quarter time, and they stretched that to a 25-point lead in the long break. If the first half had been rough, the third quarter was just brutal violence. The Sporting Globe said, "The game was full of fire and breaches of the rule," while the Argus reported, in the end, it was too difficult to say who were the aggressors, but whoever it was, neither side turned the other cheek. Players were being knocked down behind the play. One Richmond player was seen face down in the cricket pitch mud. Dyer was playing all over the ground, splitting packs and bullocking his way through and taking great marks. Richmond were just 4 points down at 3-quarter time, but the last quarter was all Fitzroy. After the game, Dyer looked across to Broadstock, who had an ice pack to his mouth. He nodded to Dyer, removed the bag of ice, showing the remains of 4 broken teeth emerging from swollen gums. Despite all the fights, knocks and punches, there was just one report. Broadstock up for kicking Fitzroy rover Noel Price. Kicking was and is still regarded as one of the most reprehensible acts on the field. Broadstock was adamant. He might be many things, but he was not a kicker. He had never been reported in his career in the VFL or in South Australia. Dyer was livid and still held a grudge 2 decades later when he wrote his autobiography. In Dyer's telling, Price hit Broadstock and then dropped to the ground without being touched. The scene was set for another extraordinary week. At the tribunal hearing on the Tuesday, Price denied being kicked, and Broadstock also denied the charge. Both said they were going for the ball, fell to the ground, and several other players landed on them. Boundary umpire Herbert Kent told a very different story, saying Broadstock kicked Price in the thigh, then Price was then restrained by trainers, stopping him attacking Broadstock, who by then was fighting another Fitzroy player. With no TV footage at this time, the commissioners had to weigh the evidence of those called before them. They returned with their verdict and sentence. Guilty, 8 weeks. Broadstock cleared his throat and made his statement. Thank you, gentlemen. It's obvious that you have not played the game. You have helped me make up my mind. I will not play football again. He put on his hat and walked out the door. As a side note, the chairman of the tribunal had played 81 games with University, as well as the famous 1916 exhibition game in London during his World War I service. News of the verdict quickly reached Punt Road, where training was wrapping up. The players were ropeable. An injustice had been perpetuated, and there needed to be a response. They demanded a meeting with the committee with a view to forfeiting the preliminary final. President Harry Dyke quickly gathered the members of the committee to work with the players who were deadly serious about their threat. An aged photographer was allowed to take a picture of the gathered players, faces steeled in determination. Boycotts in finals were not unprecedented at Tigerland. Harry Dyke would have been about 12 years old in 1904, old enough to remember when Richmond boycotted the VFA Grand Final against North Melbourne, protesting the choice of umpire for that game, a decision that the committee and club strongly defended at the time. However, that was 40 years ago. The game was bigger now. More supporters, more money, and more at stake. Dyke was not going to accept any talk of boycotts at this time. His message to the players was calm, clear, and direct. Well, lads, all I can say is that you have a duty to fulfil to your members and also to the thousands of other football followers who are looking forward to seeing you in action against Essendon. I might remind you that we, as an executive, also have a duty to carry out. We must field a side on Saturday. And if you fellows do not play, well, we'll take the second 18 down to St Kilda. So when you're discussing these things, remember those points. There was some discussion about umpires trying to intimidate players. President Dyke said he would act on that if players let him know when it happened. Dyke's last words before he left the room to the players was, "Think of how hard you have fought all season to finish on top of the ladder. Think of the old club and play." If you are wondering about the Richmond Reserves team, in 1944 they were not playing finals and they had only won 5 games and finished 10th on the ladder. The senior players discussed the situation, some still arguing for a forfeit. In the end, a consensus was agreed. They would play on the condition that the club make every effort to have an appeals board implemented to protect players' rights. It was a genuine need, and the league agreed that a board of appeal was an appropriate option. Just 54 years later, in 1998. Essendon might have been feeling confident about going into the preliminary final, given the unsettled week at Punt Road. However, they were left reeling after just the first quarter. Jack Dyer surprised all by starting at full forward. This was the answer to the question of what the Tigers would do without Dick Harris. Dyer kicked 4 goals in the first quarter and helped set up another 3 as Richmond raced out to a commanding lead, 8 goals to 50 points, to Essendon on just 5 behinds. The game was as good as won. And that was great news for Jack Broadstock, who had ditched the football and gone to the races with a portable radio, not a common accessory in the 1940s. As soon as he heard the description of the Richmond onslaught, he raced to the bookies and laid off £60 at 3-1 odds, a win of £180, before the bookies knew what was happening. That's about $16,000 in today's money. He might have been angry about being forced to miss the game, but Broadstock knew how to take advantage of an opportunity. Richmond were 8 goals up at three-quarter time and coasted in the final quarter. The Bombers added some respectability to the scoreline, going down by just 21 points, but it was Tigers into their third grand final in a row. Over at Victoria Park, the reserves grand final was won by Fitzroy, defeating Collingwood by 15 points in front of a record crowd of 7,500, and maybe setting the scene for the seniors who would be taking on the Tigers on the following Saturday. Leading Fitzroy into their first grand final in 22 years was captain-coach Fred Hewson. One of 3 brothers to play league football, the oldest, Les, played for 12 years across Collingwood, Hawthorn, Carlton, St Kilda and Fitzroy. One of only 3 players at 5 separate clubs. Younger brother Mick joined Fitzroy in 1937, playing for 6 years before he enlisted. This was Fred's 8th season with Fitzroy. Having arrived as a forward, he quickly moved to the back line as a highly rated fullback. His kicking was a joy to watch. In a demonstration event at competing against the visiting Americans, he drop-kicked 83 yards and 11 inches, about 77 metres if you prefer the metric. There were suggestions that many US football clubs would show interest in his services after the war. The age profile from earlier in the season declared that he would have won the 1943 Brownlow if it had been available, highlighting his uncanny anticipation, great marking, dashing, resolute and scrupulously fair play. Hector Lacey in the Sporting Globe declared Hewson as the champion of champions for 1943, saying Hewson could turn defence into attack with just one kick. As a fullback, he was rated with the 2 best seen in that position, alongside Collingwood's Jack Regan and Richmond's Vic Thorpe. As coach, Hewson had the knack of inspiring his players with clubroom speeches that were an object lesson for any aspiring football mentor. He was also innovative. Fitzroy started sending observers to monitor opposition clubs' training sessions in the week before the game, looking for insight and providing analysis that helped Hewson prepare his team for the game. It was his second year as coach. He'd made it to the preliminary final in 1943, and now he had his team ready for the grand final. Now, Fred Hewson may have been the playing coach, but he was also backed up by a board of advice made up of some of the most experienced and insightful analysts of the game. Percy Parrott, a Fitzroy premiership player and coach with 3 premierships and 125 games as coach. Frank Marr, long-time Essendon player and coach with 2 premierships. Dan Minogue, who had played at 3 clubs, coached at 6 and won 2 premierships as captain-coach of Richmond, and who had coached the Maroons before handing over to Hewson when the club wanted to move to a playing coach. Charlie Chapman, who'd played 124 games with the Maroons. Roy Millen, who played in the famous 1916 premiership, and Harold Lal McClellan, club president, former captain and dual premiership player. This brains trust, who knew all about winning football at the highest level, had watched the Richmond Essendon game, taken notes and met to devise a strategy and plan of action. Hewson's opponent was Richmond's captain-coach Jack Dyer. We don't have any footage of Dyer playing the game, although there are some unforgettable photos. The Channel 9 Footy Show logo was based on a photo of Jack Dyer racing away from 3 Essendon players in that 1944 preliminary final on his way to yet another goal. Those who are old enough can remember Dyer the commentator, with his unique style of mangled phrases. We know the character that he presented, and we know the legend of the rough, tough Captain Blood. Yet what I have noticed, following his career through recent episodes, was how highly regarded he was as a player, even though he had wrecked his knee in just his second season. reducing his mobility and troubling him throughout his career. Dyer was recognised as one of the best of all time by supporters and opponents alike. Melbourne premiership captain Alan LaFontaine wrote in the Sporting Globe 3 years after this grand final, when he was near the end of his career, that Dyer was still the number one player in the league. Fontaine said, "He is the only player I have known who could combine calculated robustness," what an elegant phrase, calculated robustness with an extraordinary football skill. Jack plays with a fire that has never been outdone in my experience. He would win the Richmond Best and Fairest 5 times in a team that was consistently playing finals. The award is now named in his honour. He twice led the club goal kicking, and he also captained Victoria twice. What few knew during his playing career, and is rarely noted now, is that Dyer achieved all of this while suffering from acute gastric ulcers, resulting in chronic attacks of indigestion that left him vomiting his heart out before and during games. He would never win a Brownlow. His style of play made sure of that. But there is a reason he was inducted as a legend in the Australian Football Hall of Fame and considered an immortal at Richmond. And it wasn't just because he knocked players over. He played the game like few ever had, and as a playing coach, he could lift his team like no other. This would be the last time both grand final teams were led by captain coaches, and that's a record that will never be broken. The umpire for the grand final was John Hawkins. It was his 4th grand final in a row and the last of his career. He had umpired the 2 semis and preliminary final and was considered one of the leading umpires of the day. The Tigers' dominating performance in the preliminary final had many favouring them for the big game, despite the fact that Fitzroy had beaten them in round 15 and in the semi-final. The Sporting Globe favoured the Tigers, but the Friday Herald went for Fitzroy, noting their extra turn of speed, dashing defence, and powerful goal-to-goal line. Fitzroy took an unchanged team into the game, and the Tigers also kept the same team that won against Essendon. An ongoing issue during the season had been the frustration of workers on Melbourne's tram and bus network. While everyone knew sacrifices had to be made during wartime, they were at their limit. They'd been promised more staff would be allocated by the manpower authorities to the tram and bus system, but they were still short-handed. Grand Final Day provided the stage to make their demands heard. It was Melbourne's biggest sporting day, and they were going on strike. The first tram strike in 10 years. Supporters would be limited to trains arriving either at Windsor or at St Kilda stations. The train unions were not joining the strike, but nor would they work any additional shifts to provide extra services. Taxis were being held back for emergencies, so they were not an option for football fans. Flinders Street Station was packed from about 1 p.m, with a ticket queue over 100 yards long. Car parking spots around the ground and in nearby streets were full. Hundreds trekked along St Kilda Road, with a few lucky enough to be picked up by passing motorists. Perhaps they had the right team colours showing. All of this was on the hottest day of the season, and one of the hottest grand finals ever, with the temperature nudging 30 degrees Celsius. The 2015 grand final between Hawthorn and West Coast did get to 31.3, and that holds a record for now. The public stands were full by midday, and the queues to get into the ground were 400 yards long. It was a day of waiting if you'd already been lining up at Flinders Street Station first. The heat took its toll on many, and there were 12 stretcher cases before the players took the field. 43,000 hot and sweaty supporters were squeezed into the Junction Oval, and that doesn't count the people sitting in the trees around the ground, or the more enterprising lads who climbed a 12-foot concrete and barbed wire wall, helped out by a rope and a piece of wood dropped by a colleague. For those who were able to get to the ground before the main event, the curtain raiser was the Melbourne Boys League Grand Final between Richmond Recruits and North Melbourne Colts. In an exciting and tense finish, the Richmond Recruits' better kicking saw them win by just 2 points, 6 goals 10-46, to North Melbourne Colts, 5 goals 14-44. Was it an omen for the seniors? The players entered the arena, many having cut the sleeves off their jumpers because of the heat. They lined up for the national anthem, played by the Collingwood Citizens Band. Fred Hewson won the toss and surprising many decided to kick against the strong, hot north wind. It was a scrambly, messy opening to the game, and despite kicking against the wind, Fitzroy's full forward, Ken Sire, scored the first goal of the day. Jack Dyer had switched to full forward for the Tigers, but this was not the surprise of the previous week. With Fred Hewson at fullback, the two captain coaches were playing on each other, and Hewson was clearly having the better of the game. Something was not right with Dyer. Trainers were running out to him with cold towels so he could wipe his face. The rumours that had rumbled around the town before the game were true. Dyer was not well. So ill, in fact, that Richmond's secretary, Laurie Fleming, later said that if it was him, he would have been in hospital. But Jack just went out onto the ground and took it on the chin. Richmond picked up a couple of goals late in the quarter through Bill Wilson and Fred Burge to take a small lead into the first break. It looked like they might be starting to take the game away from the Maroons when Fred Burge kicked another goal at the opening of the second quarter. But Fitzroy had other ideas. While the Tigers were trying to put them off their game with some physical attention, Fitzroy's focus was sticking to the game plan and kicking goals, 3 of them in fact, which gave them a 12-point lead at the long break. In Fitzroy's rooms, the players were on the ground, flat on their backs, legs in the air, being sprayed with water, while trainers waved towels, trying to create a cooling breeze. In another room, some of the players got a shampoo from barbers, bought in especially. Grooming was essential in 1944, or maybe it helped cool the players down as well. It wasn't a huge lead, and Richmond would have the scoring end in the third quarter, so supporters were looking forward to taking the lead. It didn't happen. While Dyer finally got his first goal, Fitzroy countered with a goal of their own. Both sides ended up kicking a couple, but that meant Fitzroy had an 11-point lead. The stifling heat, the hard-baked surface, the blustering hot north wind were tough on both teams, but Fitzroy had the benefit of a week's rest and seemed fitter as the game went on. Big Fitzroy ruckman Bert Clay just kept putting the ball into the hands of Alan Rutherman, who would direct it to advantage. As much as the Tigers pushed forward in the final quarter, the defence of Fitzroy remained strong. Fred Hewson said after the game, if they had played Essendon the week before, they could not have lasted the hard game right out. Even with the break, they still had players carrying injuries and aches from the game against Richmond 2 weeks earlier. Fitzroy's 19th man, Dan Murray, father of the legendary Brownlow winner Kevin Murray, seemed destined to spend the day sitting on the pine. But half-forward Noel Price had a slight injury in the fourth quarter, and Murray got 5 minutes on the field. A 15-point margin when the final bell rang may not seem a huge win, but the Tigers just never seemed to be able to get any closer. Fitzroy were the premiers, and when the game ended, their lion-hearted ruckman Bert Clay just collapsed, falling to the ground, unable to move amongst the chaos of supporters and teammates. The trainers had to carry him off the ground. Would it have been different if the Tigers had Harris as a forward, or Broadstock performing his magic, or if Dyer hadn't been ill? Impossible to say, but it was undeniable that Fitzroy were the better team on the day. For the second time in 3 years, Richmond were runners-up, and this Fitzroy team were the drought breakers, the history makers. 22 years after their 7th flag, they had their 8th premiership to toast their Diamond Jubilee year. Maybe it had to be this way. Years later, Fred Hewson said of the team and their win, they would not accept defeat, and any one of them would have bled for Fitzroy. They would have walked on broken glass. It was a beautiful feeling to go out on the ground with them. With the reserves winning their flag a week earlier, it was a double celebration for the Maroons. Their brains' trust had helped Fred Hewson with a plan, and the team had executed to perfection. Players were carried into the change room by the excited fans, and Richmond officials and Jack Dyer came to offer their congratulations. No theatrics from Dyer, like he reported after the 1942 loss to Essendon, just sincere recognition of Fitzroy's win. It had been the third grand final at the Junction Oval, the first two way back in 1898 and 1899, and Fitzroy had won every premiership decided there. Sadly, for the Maroons, it was the last grand final held there. Not only had Fitzroy won the premiership, they had also retained the Dyke McLennan Cup, a trophy donated by both club presidents in 1942 for games between the two clubs. Although retained was a slightly loose term, given thieves had stolen it from the Fitzroy club rooms leading up to the finals. Fortunately, it was recovered the following week by workmen repairing the roof of a factory in Ray Street, Fitzroy. I'm not sure if the thieves were ever caught. Fitzroy celebrated at their Brunswick Street Oval with a dinner and dance, even though, with no trams, some supporters and trainers had to walk all the way back from the Junction Oval, celebrating as they went. Nobody really seemed to mind. The Mayor of Fitzroy declared the premiership flags to be flown from the town hall. Richmond had their dinner at Punt Road, a quieter affair, but still an opportunity to recognise what players and coach had achieved. And while the retrospective week poster for this Fitzroy premiership features a gorilla, all contemporary reports simply refer to the club as Fitzroy as the Maroons, or the Maroons, depending on your pronunciation. They had trialled the gorilla mascot in the late 1930s, but in 1940 decided it had brought no luck and reverted to the Maroons, or Maroons. There may have been some people who kept using the gorilla nickname, but from what I have seen in all the reports of the time, it was not common. They would eventually become the Lions in 1957, but that's for a future episode. Both clubs took part in games after the grand final to raise funds for patriotic causes. Fitzroy and Essendon went to Bendigo, where the locals were entertained with a close, exciting game, Fitzroy winning by 4 points. Fitzroy, 10 goals 9-69, defeating Essendon, 9 goals 11-65. Richmond were on an end-of-season holiday in Tasmania and played a combined Tasmanian team in Hobart in front of 5,000 supporters, raising £300 in patriotic funds. Local officials asked Richmond to make a real game of it, with 12 men from the grand final and veteran Jack Dyer coming out of retirement and showing no ill effects of a year out of the game, kicking 16 goals. It was a comfortable win for the Tigers. Richmond, 30 goals, 32, 212 to Tasmania, 8 goals, 5-53. South Melbourne also travelled after the season, visiting Albury, and they were shocked to see the inroads that rugby was making with the support of the dreaded Rugby League in New South Wales, supplying rugby balls and equipment. Bill Brew, Essendon's delegate, proposed the division of Victorian country regions into 12 zones, so each club would support the growth of the game in their part of Victoria. The idea went to a subcommittee and would eventually be implemented 24 years later for the 1968 season. Faster than the appeals board for the players, at least. Some ideas do take time to get back from subcommittees. The zoning scheme lasted till 1986 when it was replaced with the draft. We'll leave the 1944 season there. In December, Fitzroy were presented with their 2 premiership pennants and Fred Hewson was awarded Fitzroy's Best and Fairest. Not a bad effort to captain coach a premiership and win the Best and Fairest in the same year. The VFA were gearing up for their return and the VFL clubs were getting ready for 1945. Would the gentleman's agreement for the return of VFA players hold? We'll see next episode. Final note, if you did listen to previous episodes, you might recall umpire Jack Elder, who officiated in 10 grand finals from 1908 to 1922, a record for the era of single umpires, and named Umpire of the Century in 1996. He died in December 1944, aged 59, and this leading man of umpires deserves to be remembered. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or you want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook and Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.